Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. In May 1880, United States Federal Marshal Alonzo W. Poole made his way toward the Brewer Ranch. Located in California's San Joaquin Valley, the property sat in the middle of an area that had been at the center of a contentious legal battle over ownership rights to land that was scheduled to be part of the Southern Pacific Railroad's northern route toward San Francisco. Tensions between landowners and the railroad had been brewing for years, culminating in a final showdown between the marshal and angry settlers. By the end of the day, 7 men would be dead. A relatively unknown moment from California's past, the Mussel Slough Tragedy, as it's known today, is a story about speculation, resources, and greed. In that way, the events of 1880 are a quintessential California and Gilded Age tale. Framed as a tragedy due to the deaths of those involved, what happened at Brewer Ranch and what led up to the confrontation at Mussel Slough illuminates one of the struggles that comes up repeatedly in California's history: the battle over precious resources, in this case, land. It also centers around one of the most transformative industries of the Gilded Age, the railroad. So this week, I am diving into the Mussel Slough Tragedy. What was it? What caused it? And what is its legacy? Grab your cup of coffee, peeps. Let's do this. Like so many events in history, the tragedy of Mussel Slough was the result of a series of events and decisions long before May 1880. As California entered the Union in 1850, people from all over the country and various parts of the world poured into the area with hopes of getting rich from gold mining. When that bubble burst and it became clear that gold did not drip from the waterways, many returned to their point of origin. But several stayed behind and made the new state their home, setting up businesses supporting the miners, engaging in farming, and raising cattle, among other pursuits. With the dawn of the 1860s came the push to connect the country via the latest in transportation technology, the railroad. Although temporarily delayed due to the Civil War, the federal government was heavily invested in the success of a transcontinental system that would finally connect the east and west coasts to facilitate travel as well as the movement of goods. Building the rail proved to be an expensive endeavor, and one of the carrots offered to developers was federal land, frequently stolen or otherwise commandeered from the surrounding indigenous communities. Thus, in addition to whatever fee they extracted for building the line itself, railroad companies also often made off with thousands of acres in land grants that they could use in whatever manner they chose. Looking to maximize profits and ensure riders, rail companies usually encouraged settlement along their constructed line and resold unused land at a markup. Railroad companies did not have a complete land monopoly. The federal government parsed out the land in tracts, breaking up parcels by even and odd numbers. Those parcels that were in odd numbers were distributed to railroad companies for development, while parcels in even sections remained in the public domain and open for settlement at a bargain price of $2.50 per acre. This system, far from the oversight of federal authorities, invited speculation and bad behavior. Anticipating a future development of the railroad, California residents sometimes purchased a plot of land in the government-owned public domain, or the even-numbered section, but then illegally moved into the odd-numbered section, hoping this might increase the overall value of their property. In an article reviewing the messaging about the tragedy, scholar William Conlog explains, quote, "It was common for settlers to buy and sell such speculative claims even before they had title. Some had multiple claims to tracts on both even-numbered government sections and odd-number railroad sections. End quote. When the Southern Pacific Railroad incorporated in California in 1865, the initial plan, and the plan that they filed with the state, was to build a line from San Francisco to Los Angeles along the coast. From Los Angeles, the line was scheduled to turn east toward the Colorado River. Like the other companies doing business at the time, the Southern Pacific wanted to ensure it received federal land grants to help offset the upfront costs associated with building the line and applied for land grants. Congressional approval came through in July 1866, with the Southern Pacific receiving similar rights and privileges as other railroads. Prior to breaking ground, Southern Pacific took a survey of their planned route and discovered a major problem. Most of the land along the coast was already held in title, and thus not available for Congress to distribute. For the Southern Pacific, this meant that the coastal route was no longer an economically feasible option, and thus the company switched tactics and decided to build their line through the San Joaquin Valley, including the Mussel Slough lands. Southern Pacific filed a new map showing the updated interior route on January 3, 1867, and received their land grant approval from Congress, placing land that was previously in the public domain into reserve for the railroad. And this is where the trouble begins. California residents, initially excited by the prospect of being connected to the rest of the country via the railroad, were growing resentful of the industry as a whole. They were frustrated by what they believed were unfair land deals, illegal claims on public land, as well as excessive fees and passenger rates. On top of everything else, service was often slow, leaving many Californians feeling that the pain simply was not worth the investment. While residents were frustrated with the entire industry, they were especially angry with the Southern Pacific, due in part to its outsized presence within the state's borders. Thus, upon hearing about the land grant approvals, several local citizens, a mix of farmers, cattle ranchers, and speculators, petitioned the Interior Department claiming that the new map was in violation of their state's original charter and therefore should not be allowed to proceed. They were not wrong, as the new map was sometimes more than 100 miles off from the original route filed in 1865. The Interior Secretary initially agreed with their argument and rescinded his withdrawal order, putting the lands back into the public domain. In response, the Southern Pacific filed their own challenge, explaining that the congressional authorization for land grants did not require that the company follow a specific route, only that the company chose a route that was most practical as determined by the company itself. Representatives for the Southern Pacific also pointed out that if they followed their original plans, they would be unable to access federal land grants. Their argument won over the Interior Secretary, who reversed course again and put the land back into a hold for the railroad company. This legal game of ping pong went back and forth for 2 years, and in the interim, several farmers moved into the area and made improvements, including completing irrigation canals and increased wheat crop development. Throughout the 1870s, as farmers moved into the area around Mussel Slough hoping to preempt the land, they tried repeatedly to obtain the appropriate authorization at the local land office. Their applications were refused, either because the land in dispute was considered held in reservation for future development by the Southern Pacific, or because the order issued by the Secretary of the Interior had not become effective yet. Residents even pushed forward a petition to Congress, asking the legislative body to restore the lands back to the public domain. But Congress declined, as they had already approved the land grant agreement for the Southern Pacific. Feeling stuck between a rock and a hard place, the settlers began to panic. In 1876, the Southern Pacific issued a pamphlet advertising settlement along their planned route, explaining how interested parties could acquire title when the lands were ready for sale. Included in this pamphlet was the promise that, quote, if the settler desires to buy, the company gives him first privilege of purchase at the fixed price, which, in every case, shall only be the value of the land without regard to improvements, end quote. Local residents interpreted this to mean that Southern Pacific was going to issue titles for the same price as the federal government, and not for a more substantial profit. Imagine their surprise when in October 1877, Southern Pacific began offering settlers land claims at significantly elevated rates, sometimes as much as $20 or more per acre. When challenged about these price points, the railroad company responded that their pricing reflected their improvements on the land, while disregarding any improvements settlers may have made. $20 per acre was out of reach for many residents who felt they were running out of options. Tired of fighting separately, roughly 600 farmers and settlers formed an alliance in 1878 to challenge what they saw as the railroad company's deceptive and illegal tactics. Known as the Settlers' Grand League, the group launched a two-pronged legal strategy. First, they tried to get the Southern Pacific land title voided and restored to the public domain by arguing that because the company changed its route, it did not have legal rights to the land to begin with. If this strategy failed, the League hoped to apply enough pressure to force the courts to declare that the $2.50 per acre price was binding, regardless of any improvement, whether by the railroad or the settlers, made on the land. They failed on both accounts. With their legal avenues exhausted, some settlers simply refused to leave and refused to pay, leaving the rail line with little other option than eviction. And so, on May 11th, 1880, U.S. Marshal Alonzo Poole, Southern Pacific land grader Walter Clark, and two local citizens, Walter Crowe and Mills Hart, rode out to the Brewer Ranch. Poole carried orders from the federal court in San Francisco to evict Brewer for refusing to pay the Southern Pacific Railroad their asking price. Walter Crowe likely joined the group of men to take ownership of his new property, having purchased the parcel in question from the Southern Pacific, and the four, who would later be referred to as railroad men, were prepared for a fight as they carried both handguns and shotguns in their wagon. At some point, a second group of men arrived on horseback. The actual number of participants is disputed, with estimates ranging anywhere from 20 to 50 local settlers, and the details of the day are hard to decipher. It is unknown, for example, who fired first. It is believed that at some point some excited commotion frightened a horse, which may have led to someone in the crowd opening fire. There is evidence to suggest that the U.S. Marshal did not engage in the firefight and was subdued early in the scuffle. 5 of the settlers involved in the fight were later convicted of resisting a federal officer and served 6 months in a jail in San Jose. In the weeks and months after, members of the Grand League tried to maintain public support. Despite the heated rhetoric before the May confrontation, where settlers all but guaranteed bloodshed should the government fail to come to their aid, League members now tried to portray themselves as innocent victims of violence and evil corporate greed, neglecting, of course, the fact that they had moved on to lands illegally and had thus far refused to make any payments. Their efforts to maintain public sympathy were also thwarted by the leaders of the Southern Pacific, who were able to successfully take control of the early narrative. As described by William Conlog, quote, company officials in San Francisco, including President Charles Crocker, personally visited newspapers with a version of events that was published the next day, end quote. League members also had to contend with their own troubled past of violence, as members had a history of arson and terrorizing individuals they identified as holding pro-railroad sentiments. Try as they might to convince the public otherwise, the general consensus turned against the League, and it became clear that while Southern Pacific may have had significant resources at its disposal, the farmers and cattle ranchers of Mussel Slough were not exactly the poor, defenseless underdogs they tried to portray. The Grand League had successfully managed to develop and use lands without making payments to the rail company for years before it all came crashing down. By the summer of 1880, with the League leaders facing charges and their PR campaign in shambles, several settlers sought to negotiate with the railroad and pay the elevated price for their land. The Southern Pacific sold their plots, built their route, and went on to become one of the most influential railroad lines in the country. Despite the incident being fairly unknown today, the Mussel Slough shootout had cultural influence, inspiring the 1901 novel The Octopus, A Story of California, by Frank Norris, which only helped perpetuate the narrative that the violence that May Day in 1880 was a struggle between good and evil, with Norris painting the settlers and farmers as decent, hardworking citizens. So, was this land dispute, like the members of the Grand League would have us believe, an example of David versus Goliath, an epic battle between the big corporation and the little helpless farmer? The evidence, in my interpretation, points to no. Railroads were by no means ethical companies, and they were corrupt entities that overcharged and displaced people for the sake of profit. But in this specific instance, the tragedy is that settlers made a gamble, and they lost. They did not have the law on their side, and public opinion was not enough to slay the big, bad railroad dragon. As historian John Larimore asserts, quote, "The judicial opinions bearing upon these issues determined the very existence of the Southern Pacific Railroad of California. Had the settler position been upheld, it is highly possible that, deprived of its rights to the land grant, the Southern Pacific would have ceased to operate in California, and further, would not have possessed the tremendous amount of influence which it in fact exercised upon the political and economic life of the state." End quote. Ultimately, the battle at Mussel Slough only helped intensify anti-railroad sentiment and increase calls for regulation over the industry. It became a symbol of agrarian populism, of farmers standing up against an injustice, whether it was right or wrong. The debate over who should have access to resources was and remains a quintessential question, not just in California, but one that tends to dominate its history and continues to factor into debates today. In the end, the Mussel Slough tragedy stands as a lasting reminder that conflicts over land, power, and fairness can shape public policy and collective memory for generations. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.